The colonies were growing fast, but so were their troubles. People worked hard from sunrise to sunset, yet the money they earned seemed to slip away in endless taxes. The British Crown demanded more every year, on sugar, stamps, paper, and even tea. Every coin they paid reminded them that their voices did not matter. They were ruled by a king across the ocean who had never seen their struggles, who knew nothing of their lives. Mothers cried over high prices, and fathers sat in silence, wondering how long they could survive under laws they never chose. British soldiers walked their streets, watched their homes, and demanded obedience. It felt as if freedom was slowly being stolen. The people began to talk, quietly at first, in taverns, in churches, and around kitchen fires. Words like rights and liberty started to grow louder. Boston became the heart of resistance. The tension was so thick that even the air felt heavy. One night in 1770, a small crowd gathered near the customs house. Angry voices met cold soldiers. A single spark, a rock, a shout, no one really knew, and shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. The people called it the Boston Massacre. Their blood on the cobblestones turned grief into fury. Across the colonies, the story spread like fire in dry grass. The anger did not fade. It only grew stronger. 3 years later, British ships filled the harbor with tea, a symbol of unfair rule. But the people of Boston had had enough. On a cold December night in 1773, men disguised as Mohawk Indians crept through the dark, boarded the ships, and threw every chest of tea into the icy water. The harbor turned black with defiance. The message was clear: we will not be slaves to greed. The king was furious. He sent more soldiers, passed stricter laws, and closed Boston's port. But instead of breaking their spirit, his anger united the colonies. Leaders from every corner of America gathered in Philadelphia to talk about their future. Men like George Washington, John Adams, and Patrick Henry sat in candlelight, faces tense but determined. They spoke not of surrender, but of freedom. Patrick Henry's voice shook the room when he declared, "Give me liberty, or give me death." Those words were not just a speech, they were a spark that lit a revolution. From that day, the colonies knew there was no going back. Farmers, blacksmiths, and teachers began to train with old muskets. The air was thick with fear and courage. They did not yet have an army, but they had something greater, a belief that freedom was worth fighting for. The ground beneath them was changing, and soon, the first shots of war would echo through the dawn of a new America. Boston was still restless. People could not forget the blood spilled on their streets, and the anger against the British Crown grew stronger every day. Soldiers marched openly through the town, and the red of their coats reminded everyone that they were not free. Every law, every order from London felt like a chain tightening around the colonies. Then came a night that would change everything. British ships anchored in the Boston harbor, loaded with chests of tea. It was not just tea, it was a symbol of control. The British wanted to show that they could still tax the colonies however they pleased. But the people had already reached their limit. Meetings were held in secret, whispers filled the taverns, and plans were made in the dark. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. The disguise was not for fear, it was a statement. They wanted the world to know they stood as Americans, not subjects. They moved silently toward the harbor, the cold wind cutting through their coats. The moonlight reflected on the calm water as they climbed aboard the ships. Without shouting, without hesitation, they went to work. One by one, the heavy wooden chests of tea were lifted and thrown into the sea. The water turned dark as the tea spread through the waves. The sound of splashing echoed like thunder in the quiet night. No violence, no looting, only a powerful act of defiance. When the morning came, the whole city knew. The British flag still waved, but its power had cracked. The act became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it sent a shock through every colony. Some feared the punishment that would come, but others felt pride for the first time. Ordinary people had stood up to the world's strongest empire and said no. The news spread quickly, from New York to Virginia. The colonies began to see themselves as one people with one struggle. The British government reacted with anger. The king closed Boston's port, cutting off trade and food. Soldiers filled the city, and people went hungry. But instead of breaking their will, the harsh punishment brought the colonies closer together. Leaders from across the land knew they had to act. They gathered in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. It was the first time men from all 13 colonies sat together to discuss freedom. Some wanted peace, others wanted to fight, but all agreed that things could not stay the same. Patrick Henry rose from his seat and spoke with fire in his voice. "Give me liberty, or give me death," he cried. His words struck the hearts of everyone in the room. They understood now that freedom had a price, and they were ready to pay it. The road to revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. By the spring of 1775, the air in the colonies was tense and heavy. People were tired of waiting for peace. Letters from London brought only new demands, not solutions. The British sent more soldiers, more orders, more warnings. The colonies began to prepare for the worst. Farmers sharpened old tools into weapons, and towns trained men called Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew when. In the small town of Lexington, the morning of April 19, 1775, began quietly. A group of colonial soldiers stood on the village green, their muskets ready but their hearts uneasy. The sun had not yet risen when British troops marched toward them. The red coats glimmered faintly in the dawn light. The British had come to seize weapons and arrest leaders who were calling for rebellion. The two sides faced each other in silence. No one wanted to start a war, but no one wanted to bow anymore. Suddenly, a gun fired. No one knew who pulled the trigger first. That single shot became known as the shot heard round the world. It was the sound of freedom being born. The British opened fire, and several colonists fell. But the rest stood their ground. The soldiers moved on to Concord, where more Minutemen were waiting. There, the colonists struck back. They hid behind walls and trees, firing as the British marched. It wasn't a grand battle, it was a fight of ordinary people defending their homes. The British were shocked by the courage they faced. By the time they returned to Boston, dozens of their men were dead or wounded. The colonists had proved that they would no longer be ruled by fear. News of the fight spread fast. Across the colonies, church bells rang and men gathered with muskets in hand. For the first time, the people of America realized that this was not just protest anymore, it was war. They were no longer subjects of the crown, they were defenders of their own land. In the following weeks, thousands of colonists surrounded Boston. They built camps, shared food, and waited for the next battle. George Washington, a tall and quiet man from Virginia, was chosen to lead them. His presence gave hope to everyone. He did not wear a crown or carry fancy weapons, only determination and faith in the cause of freedom. The revolution had begun. The people had no proper army, little money, and almost no supplies. But they had something far greater, belief. They believed in a future where no man would kneel before a king. The world was watching a new kind of nation take its first steps, born not from power or wealth, but from courage and the will to be free. The war had begun, and there was no going back. Smoke rose from small towns, and families watched their sons march off to fight with hope in their hearts and fear in their eyes. The colonies were still unorganized, but they shared one purpose, freedom. Across the land, men gathered to decide what must be done next. In 1776, in Philadelphia, the talk of independence grew stronger than ever. The hall where they met was filled with tension. Some men wanted peace, others said peace was already lost. The British army was powerful, but the spirit of the colonies burned brighter. They were tired of being ruled, taxed, and ignored. They wanted to be heard as free people. Inside that room sat men whose names would echo through history: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and many others. After days of debate, they agreed on something bold: to break completely from Britain. Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write the document that would explain to the world why. He worked quietly, his pen moving through the night, shaping words that would carry the dreams of millions. When he finished, the paper spoke not of anger but of truth. It said that all men are created equal and that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and happiness. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was approved. It was a moment that changed history. The men who signed it knew they were risking everything: their lives, their homes, their families. If they lost the war, they would be executed as traitors. But still, they signed with steady hands. Each signature was an act of courage, a promise that freedom was worth any price. Outside, church bells rang. People cheered and cried. For the first time, they called themselves Americans. But celebration quickly turned to struggle. The British would not let them go so easily. War swept across the land, and battles broke out from the north to the south. George Washington led his troops through hard fights and harder winters. His army was small, often hungry, and poorly clothed. Yet he never gave up. His belief in liberty gave his men strength when hope was nearly gone. In dark nights, he looked at the stars and prayed for the strength to keep his soldiers alive and his dream unbroken. The Declaration had lit a fire that could not be put out. Across the colonies, people read Jefferson's words aloud by candlelight. They felt the truth in them, that freedom was not a gift from kings but a right given by God. Even as war raged, those words gave them courage. The United States of America was now more than an idea, it was a promise, born from sacrifice, carried by faith, and written in the hearts of those who refused to live as slaves to a crown. Winter came hard for the soldiers of the new nation. The year was 1777, and the war had turned cruel. Many men had no shoes, no warm clothes, and little food. Snow covered the ground like a white blanket of silence. They built rough huts in a place called Valley Forge, hoping to survive the long, bitter months ahead. Some soldiers wrapped rags around their feet to stop the bleeding from the cold. Hunger was a daily battle. George Washington rode through the camp each morning, his heart heavy but his face calm. He spoke softly to the men, thanking them for their courage. He had no riches to give them, only faith. He believed that if they could endure the winter, they could endure anything. Around him, campfires flickered like stars in the darkness, symbols of a nation still alive. There were moments when everything seemed lost. Some soldiers wanted to go home, others lay sick and weak. Supplies from Congress were slow, and promises of help often broke apart. Yet, in the middle of this suffering, something powerful began to grow. The soldiers started to see themselves not just as men from different colonies, but as brothers fighting for one dream. A new spirit filled the camp. Under the guidance of a foreign officer named Baron von Steuben, the men began to train. He taught them how to fight together, how to march, how to trust one another in battle. Slowly, the ragged group turned into a real army. Their rifles were cleaner, their steps stronger, and their hearts more united. Washington watched with quiet pride. He wrote letters by candlelight, telling Congress that his men were ready to keep fighting, no matter how long it took. Every night he prayed for them, not just for victory, but for the courage to keep going. As the snow melted and spring arrived, the soldiers marched out of Valley Forge different from how they had entered. They were lean, hardened, and filled with determination. The months of suffering had turned them into something unbreakable. Across the land, families waited for news, hoping the sacrifices were not in vain. The people sent what little they had: bread, clothes, prayers. They knew freedom was being built with every step those soldiers took. When Washington looked upon his army, he no longer saw fear. He saw belief. The dream of liberty had survived the cold. It had survived hunger, pain, and death. Out of the snow and struggle, a true American army was born, one that would carry the fight until the very end. Valley Forge became more than a place, it became a symbol of what it meant to be American, to endure, to believe, and to keep the flame of freedom alive even in the darkest winter. The long years of war had worn everyone down. Towns were in ruins, farms were empty, and families were scattered. But the Americans did not give up. They had learned to fight with heart, not just with weapons. Each battle brought new pain but also new strength. By 1781, hope began to rise again. The British Army, once sure of victory, was now struggling. Their soldiers were tired, and their supplies were running low. The war had turned against them. George Washington knew the time had come to strike the final blow. News arrived that British General Cornwallis had set up camp in Yorktown, Virginia. It was a risky move for the British, they were trapped between land and sea. Washington gathered his men, and with help from the French Army and Navy, he began a bold plan. Together, they marched south, moving quietly and quickly. The journey was long and harsh, but the soldiers' spirits were high. They knew this could be the end of it all. When they reached Yorktown, the sight of British tents filled them with determination. Cannons were set, trenches were dug, and the siege began. Day and night, the thunder of cannon fire echoed through the fields. Smoke covered the sky, and the ground shook under the weight of battle. Inside the British camp, fear grew. Cornwallis realized he was surrounded, there was no escape by land or sea. The French Navy had blocked the harbor, cutting off reinforcements. For days, the fighting continued. American and French troops pushed closer and closer, never giving up. Then, On October 19, 1781, the impossible happened. The British raised a white flag. General Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington. The war was over. After 6 long years of blood, loss, and sacrifice, victory belonged to the Americans. When the British drums fell silent, tears filled the eyes of soldiers who had once been farmers, teachers, and craftsmen. They had fought for something greater than themselves. The air was filled with the sound of cheers, but beneath the joy was a deep, quiet peace. They had done the impossible, defeated the most powerful empire in the world. Washington stood tall, his face calm and thoughtful. He knew this victory was not just his, it belonged to every man and woman who had believed in freedom. The soldiers returned to their homes with pride and scars that would never fade. The war had ended, but its memory would live forever. Across the land, church bells rang, children laughed, and families embraced. America had been born, not from wealth or power, but from courage, unity, and faith. The revolution had ended, and a new chapter of hope began. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was now a living reality written in the hearts of the people. After the victory at Yorktown, the colonies finally breathed again. The war was over, but the work of building a new nation was just beginning. The soldiers returned home, carrying memories that would never leave them. Many had lost friends, homes, and years of their lives, yet they felt proud. They had won their freedom, but now they had to decide what to do with it. The land was free, but freedom alone could not build a country. The leaders of the new nation met again in Philadelphia. The air was filled with both hope and uncertainty. They knew they could not live as 13 separate colonies anymore. They needed one strong government to unite them. But how could they create it without repeating the mistakes of the old world? Every man in that room had his own idea of what America should become. George Washington was tired from years of war, yet his presence brought peace to the meeting. People trusted him. He had proven that power did not control him, duty did. The men looked to him for guidance as they began the long discussions that would shape their future. It was not easy. There were arguments, disagreements, and long nights of writing and rewriting. Out of those struggles came something truly remarkable, the Constitution of the United States. It was not a document of kings or rulers, it was written by ordinary men for ordinary people. It declared that power came from the people, not from a throne. It set limits so that no leader could ever become a tyrant again. It promised justice, liberty, and equality, even though those promises would take time to reach everyone. When the Constitution was finally completed in 1787, many of the men felt a deep silence fill the room. They knew they had created something new in the world, a system where freedom had a foundation, not just a dream. As Washington was chosen to be the first president, he accepted with humility, not pride. He said he would serve only because his country needed him. His words reminded everyone that true leadership comes from service, not power. People across the states celebrated. Flags waved, church bells rang, and families gathered in prayer. They were no longer 13 colonies divided by borders and differences, they were now one nation, the United States of America. But Washington and the others knew that freedom was fragile. It would need honesty, courage, and unity to survive. The revolution had won independence, but building a nation would require wisdom. As the sun set over Philadelphia that day, the dream that had begun in whispers and battle cries finally became real. America was born, not perfect, but alive with promise. The people had written their own destiny, proving that hope and courage could shape a nation that would stand for freedom forever. The new nation had taken its first steps, but peace did not come easily. The land was scarred by war, and the people were still learning what it meant to be free. Many towns were broken, farms were empty, and families struggled to start again. Yet, there was hope in every heart. For the first time, Americans could decide their own future. They no longer answered to a king, and that feeling alone gave strength to rebuild. George Washington became the first president in 1789. The people trusted him like a father. He had led them through war, and now he would lead them through peace. He wore no crown and demanded no riches. His only wish was to serve. When he took the oath of office, he placed his hand on the Bible and promised to protect the nation with honesty and faith. The crowd that watched him knew they were seeing history, a man chosen by the people, not by birth or power. The early years were not easy. The government was small, the treasury was empty, and enemies still watched from across the seas. Many people argued about how the country should be run. Some wanted strong central power, Others feared it would lead back to tyranny. But Washington reminded them all that unity was their greatest weapon. He said that Americans must act as one nation, not as divided states. Slowly, progress began. Roads were built, trade grew, and new laws brought order. The Constitution guided every decision, reminding everyone that freedom came with responsibility. People worked together, even when they disagreed. They were learning the art of democracy, something the world had rarely seen succeed. Through all this, Washington carried the weight of leadership quietly. He refused to rule by fear. He believed in setting an example, showing that a leader should serve his people, not control them. When his term was ending, everyone begged him to stay, but he refused. He wanted America to prove it could stand without him. His farewell was simple but powerful. He warned that division and greed could destroy the freedom they had fought for, and he asked Americans to stay united in peace, just as they had in war. When Washington left office, the people wept. They knew they were saying goodbye to a man who had given everything for the dream of liberty. He returned to his farm in Mount Vernon, living quietly until his final days. His life became a symbol of the nation itself, strong, humble, and guided by faith. The young United States continued to grow, facing new challenges but always holding to its belief in freedom. The war had created a country, now courage and wisdom would keep it alive. The dream that had begun in 13 colonies was now a living nation, built on sacrifice, hope, and the promise that freedom would last for generations to come. Years passed, and the wounds of war began to heal. The young nation started to find its rhythm. Cities grew, ships filled the harbors, and fields turned green again. The people worked hard to build a life of peace after years of struggle. The 13 colonies had now become one nation, stronger and more united than ever before. But freedom still came with challenges. The new government had to prove that liberty could survive not only battles but also time. In the towns and countryside, people spoke proudly of being Americans. They were no longer just farmers, blacksmiths, or merchants under a king, they were citizens of their own land. They elected leaders, voted on laws, and debated ideas about justice and equality. It was not a perfect system, but it was their own, and that made all the difference. George Washington's example lived on even after he was gone. Every president who came after him tried to follow his path, humble, honest, and devoted to the people. The Constitution guided them like a light in the dark. It reminded everyone that freedom needed care, patience, and respect. There were disagreements and divisions too. States argued about rights, and people had different visions for the country's future. But every time problems arose, Americans looked back to the same truth: unity was their greatest strength. They had learned from war that when they stood together, nothing could break them. As new generations grew up, they heard stories of their fathers and grandfathers who had fought for independence. These stories were told around fires, in schools, and in churches. They were not just history, they were lessons about courage, sacrifice, and belief. The spirit of freedom passed from one heart to another. Trade increased, roads stretched across the land, and new states joined the Union. America was expanding, reaching out with hope and determination. People dreamed of new possibilities, of schools, farms, towns, and families living in peace. The same courage that once fought on battlefields now built homes and businesses. Though the nation was young, its voice was already strong. Other countries began to notice. This new land across the ocean was living proof that people could govern themselves. It inspired many who still lived under kings. The promise made by the revolution was slowly being fulfilled. The flag that once flew over small battlefields now waved proudly over a free people. Every star and stripe told a story of struggle and triumph. The 13 colonies had not just won a war, they had created an idea that all men have the right to live free. The world had seen nations built on power, but this one was built on hope. And from that hope, America began its long journey, a land born from sacrifice, carried by unity, and destined to stand as a symbol of freedom for all time. Even after independence, the work of building the United States was just beginning. The colonies were free from British rule, but freedom alone could not make a nation strong. The people had to learn how to live together under one government, how to respect laws, and how to protect the rights they had fought so hard to win. Every citizen, from farmer to merchant, had a part to play in shaping the country's future. Communities began to rebuild, homes destroyed by war were repaired, and families returned to their fields. Towns started schools so children could learn about the new nation they belonged to. People gathered in churches and town halls to discuss ideas about justice, fairness, and responsibility. It was clear that freedom was not just about winning battles, it was about living with respect for one another and making decisions together. The Constitution became the guide for this new life. It was more than paper, it was a promise. It said that leaders could only govern with the consent of the people. It set limits on power and protected the rights of citizens. This idea was new to the world, and the Americans knew they had to guard it carefully. Arguments and disagreements were natural, but the system gave them a way to solve problems without violence. George Washington and the first leaders of the country set examples for everyone. They served not for riches or power but out of duty to their nation. Their lives showed that leadership meant responsibility, honesty, and sacrifice. Ordinary citizens learned that freedom was not only a gift, it was a responsibility to act with courage and integrity. As the years passed, the United States grew. New states joined the Union, and trade across the land and seas increased. Roads, bridges, and towns expanded, connecting people and ideas. Farmers grew crops to feed the nation, and craftsmen built the tools and homes needed for a strong society. Slowly, the dream that began in 13 struggling colonies became a living reality. Stories of the revolution were passed down from parents to children. Every tale of bravery, sacrifice, and hope reminded the people that freedom was earned and precious. Americans began to understand that their country's success depended on unity, faith, and courage, just as it had during the war. The flag of the United States, once carried across battlefields, now waved over peaceful towns, schools, and homes. Each star and stripe was a reminder of the struggle and sacrifice that created the nation. Freedom was no longer just a dream, it was a responsibility shared by all. The 13 colonies had become one nation. They had learned that courage, sacrifice, and unity could shape a future worth living for. America was no longer a collection of settlements, it was a country built on the belief that freedom was worth protecting, passing from one generation to the next, and living as a promise for all who would call it home.